Yes. I'm fine. But I will see. Yes. Chapter 1. Swami invites the hippies. Hare Krishna.
What is the date?
16 January. Swami invites the hippies, January 16, 1967. As the United Airlines jet descended on the San Francisco Bay Area, Srila Prabhupada turned to his disciple Ramchora and said, "The building blocks look like matchboxes. Just imagine how it looks from Krishna's point of view." Srila Prabhupada was 71 years old, and this had been his first air trip. Ranchora, 19 and dressed in a suit and tie, was supposed to be Srila Prabhupada's secretary. He was a new disciple, but had raised some money and had asked to fly to San Francisco with Srila Prabhupada. During the trip, Srila Prabhupada had spoken little. He had been chanting, "Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare." His right hand in his cloth and bead bag, he had been fingering one bead after another as he chanted silently to himself. When the plane had first risen over New York City, he had looked out of the window at the buildings growing smaller and smaller. Then the plane had entered the clouds, which to Prabhupada had appeared like an ocean in the sky. He had been bothered by pressure blocking his ears and had mentioned it. Otherwise, he hadn't said much, but had only chanted Krishna's name over and over. Now as the plane began its descent, he continued to chant, his voice slightly audible, "Krishna, Krishna, Krishna." And he looked out out the window at the vista of thousands of matchboxes, houses, streets stretching in the charted pattern in every direction. When the announcement for United Airlines Flight 21 from New York came over the public address came over the public address system, the group of about 50 hippies gathered closer together in anticipation. For a moment, they were almost apprehensive, unsure of what to expect or what the Swami would be like. Robel Segal. We were quite in an assorted lot, even for the San Francisco airport. Mukund was wearing a Marilyn the Magician robe with paisley squares all around. Sam was wearing a Moroccan sheep robe with a hood. He even smelled like a sheep. And I was wearing a sort of blue homemade Japanese samurai robe with small white dots. Long strings of beads were everywhere. Buckskins, boots, army fatigues, people wearing small round sunglasses, the whole phantasmagoria of San Francisco at its height. Only a few people in the crowd knew Swamiji, Mukund and his wife Janki, Ravindra Swarup, Ram, all from New York, and Allen Ginsberg was there. A few days before, Allen had been one of the leaders of Human Bee in the Golden Gate Park, where over 200,000 had come together, a gathering of tribes for joyful powwow and feast dance. Today, Allen was on hand to greet Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had met and chanted with several years before on New York's Lower East Side. Swamiji would be pleased, Mukund reminded everyone, if they were all chanting Hare Krishna when he came through the gate. They were already familiar with the Hare Krishna mantra. They had heard about the Swami's chanting in the park in New York, or they had seen the articles about Swamiji and the chanting in the local underground paper, the Oracle. Earlier today, they had gathered in the Golden Gate Park, most of them responding to a flyer Mukunda had distributed, and had chanted there for more than an hour before coming to the airport in the caravan of cars. Now many of them, also in response to Mukunda's flyer, stood with incense and flowers in their hands. As the disembarking passengers entered the terminal gate and walked up the tram, they looked in amazement at the reception party of flower-bearing chanters. The chanters, however, gazed past these ordinary, tired-looking travelers, searching for that special person who was supposed to be on the plane. Suddenly, strolling toward them was Swami, golden complexion, dressed in bright saffron robes. Prabhupada had heard the chanting even before he had entered the terminal, and he had begun to smile. He was happy and surprised. Glancing over the faces, he recognized only a few. Yet here were 50 people receiving him and chanting Hare Krishna without his having said a word. Mukund, we just had a look at Swamiji and then we bowed down, myself, my wife, and the friends I had brought, Sam and Majoral. And then all of the young man and woman there followed suit and all bowed down to Swamiji, just feeling very confident that it was the right and proper thing to do. The crowd of hippies had formed a line on either side of narrow passage through which Swamiji would walk. As he passed among his new admirers, dozens of hands stretched out to offer him flowers and incense. He smiled, collecting the offerings in his hands while Ramchoda looked on. Allen Ginsberg stepped forward with a large bouquet of flowers, and Srila Prabhupada graciously accepted it. Then Prabhupada began offering the gifts back to all who reached out to receive them. He proceeded through the terminal, the crowd of young people walking beside him, chanting. At the baggage claim, Srila Prabhupada waited for a moment, his eyes taking in everyone around him. Lifting his open palms, he beckoned everyone to chant louder, and the group burst into renewed chanting, with Prabhupada standing in their midst, softly clapping his hands and singing Hare Krishna. Gracefully, he then raised his arms above his head and began to dance, stepping and swaying from side to side. To the mixed chagrin, amusement, and irresistible joy of airport workers and passengers, the reception party stayed with Prabhupada until he got his luggage. Then they escorted him outside into the sunlight and into the waiting car, a black 1949 Cadillac Fleetwood. Prabhupada got into the back seat with Mukund and Allen Ginsberg. Until the moment the car pulled away from the curb, Srila Prabhupada, still smiling, continued handing flowers to all those who had come to welcome him as he brought Krishna consciousness west. The Cadillac belonged to Harvey Cohen, who almost a year before had allowed Prabhupada to stay in his Bowery loft. Harvey was driving, but because of his chauffeur's head picked up at a Salvation's Army store and his black suit and his beard, Prabhupada did not recognize him. Prabhupada asked, "Where is Harvey?" "He's driving," Mukunda said. "Oh, is that you? I didn't recognize you." Harvey smiled. "Welcome to San Francisco, Swamiji." Srila Prabhupada was happy to be in another big western city on behalf of his spiritual master Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati and Lord Chaitanya. The further west one goes, Lord Chaitanya had said, the more materialistic the people. Yet Lord Chaitanya had also said that Krishna consciousness will spread all over the world. Prabhupada's god brother had often wondered about Lord Chaitanya's statement that one day the name of Krishna would be sung in every town and village. Perhaps that verse should be taken symbolically, they said. Otherwise, what could it mean, Krishna in every town? But Srila Prabhupada had deep faith in the statement by Lord Chaitanya and in the instruction of his spiritual master. Here he was in the far western city of San Francisco, and already people were chanting. They had enthusiastically received him with flowers and kirtan. And all over the world, there were other cities much like this one. The temple Mukunda and his friends had obtained was on the Frederick Street in the Haight Ashbury district. Like the temple at 26 Second Avenue in New York, it was a small storefront, the display window facing the street. A sign over the window read, Shri Shri Radha Krishna Temple. Mukund and his friends had also rented a 3-room apartment for Swamiji on the 3rd floor of the adjoining building. It was a small, bare, run-down apartment facing the street. Followed by several carloads of devotees and curious seekers, Srila Prabhupada arrived at 518 Frederick Street and entered the storefront, which was decorated only by a few Madras clothes on the wall. Taking his seat on the cushion, he led a kirtan and then he spoke, inviting everyone to take up to Krishna consciousness. After his lecture, he left the storefront and walked next door up to the 2 flights of stairs on his apartment. As he entered his apartment, number 32, he followed not only by his devotees and admirers, but also by reporters from San Francisco's main newspaper, the Chronicle and the Examiner. While some devotees cooked his lunch and Anchoda unpacked his suitcase, Swamiji talked with the reporters, who sat on the floor taking notes on their pads. Reporter, downstairs you said you were inviting everyone to Krishna consciousness. Does that include the Haight Ashbury, Bohemians and Beatniks? Prabhupada, yes, everyone, including you or anybody else, be he or she, what is called an acid head or hippie or something else. But once he is accepted for training, he becomes something else from what he had been before. Reporter, what does one had to do to become a member of your movement? Prabhupada, there are 4 prerequisites. I do not allow my students to keep girlfriends. I prohibit all kind of intoxicants, including coffee, tea and cigarettes. I prohibit meat eating. And I prohibit my students from taking part in gambling. Reporters, do these shall not commandments extend to the use of LSD, marijuana and other narcotics? Prabhupada, I consider LSD to be an intoxicant. I do not allow any of my students to use that or any intoxicant. I train my students to rise early in the morning, to take a bath early in the day, and to attend prayer meetings 3 times a day. Our sect is one of austerity. It is the science of God. Although Prabhupada had found that reporters generally did not report his philosophy, he took the opportunity to preach Krishna consciousness. Even if the reporters did not want to delve into the philosophy, his followers did. The big mistake of modern civilization, Srila Prabhupada continued, is to encroach upon others' property as though it were their own. This creates an unnatural disturbance. God is the ultimate proprietor of everything in the universe. When people know that God is ultimate proprietor, the best friend of all living entities, and the object of all offerings and sacrifices, then there will be peace. The reporter asked him about his background, and he told briefly about his coming from India and beginning in New York. After the reporters left, Prabhupada continued speaking to the young people in his room. Mukund, who had allowed his hair and beard to grow, but who wore around his neck the strand of large red beads Swamiji had given him at initiation, introduced some of his friends and explained that they were all living together and that he wanted to help Swamiji present Krishna consciousness to the young people of San Francisco. Mukunda's wife Janaki asked Swamiji about his plane ride. He said it had been pleasant except for some pressure in the ears. The house looked like matchboxes, he said, and with his thumb and forefinger he indicated the size of matchboxes. He leaned back against the wall and took off the garlands he had received that day, until one beaded necklace, a common inexpensive item with a small bell on it, remained hanging around his neck. Prabhupada held it, inspected the workmanship, and toyed with it. This is special, he said, looking up because it was made with devotion. He continued to pay attention to the necklace as if receiving it had been one of the most important events of the day. When his lunch arrived, he distributed some to everyone. And then Ranchoda efficiently, though tactlessly, asked everyone to leave and gave the Swami a little time to eat and rest. Outside the apartment and in the storefront below, the talk was of Swamiji. No one had been disappointed. Everything Mukunda had been telling them about him was true. They particularly enjoyed how he had talked about seeing everything from Krishna's viewpoint. That night on television, Swamiji's arrival was covered on the 11 o'clock news, and in the next day it appeared in the newspaper. The examiner's story was on the page 2. Swami invites the hippies, along with the photo of a temple filled with followers and some shot of Swamiji, who looked very grieved. Prabhupada read, Mukunda read the article aloud. The lanky masters of faith Mukunda read, attired in a flowing, ankle-long robe, sitting cross-legged on a big mattress. Swamiji interrupted. What is this word lanky? Mukunda explained that it meant tall and slender. I do not know why they said that, he added. Maybe it's because you sit so straight and tall, so they think that you are very tall. The article went on to describe many of the airport greeters as being one of long-haired, bearded, and sandaled set. San Francisco's largest paper, the Chronicle, also ran an article, Swami in Hippie Land, Holy Man opens SF Temple. The article began, a holy man from India described by his friend and beat poet Allen Ginsberg as one of the more conservative leaders of his faith, launched a kind of evangelistic effort yesterday in the heart of San Francisco's hippie heaven. Srila Prabhupada objected to being called conservative. He was indignant. Conservative, how is that? Mukunda suggested, in respect to sex and drugs. Of course, we are conservative in that sense. That simply means we are following Shastra. We cannot depart from Bhagavad Gita. But conservative we are not. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was so strict that he would not even look on women. But we are accepting everyone into this movement, regardless of sex, caste, position, or whatever. Everyone is invited to chant Hare Krishna. This is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's munificence, his liberality. No, we are not conservative. Srila Prabhupada rose from bed and turned on light. It was 1 a.m. Although the alarm had not sounded and no one had come to wake him, he had risen on his own. The apartment was cold and quiet. Wrapping his chadar around his shoulders, he sat quietly at his makeshift desk, a trunk filled with manuscripts, and in deep concentration chanted the Hare Krishna mantra on his beads. After an hour of chanting, Srila Prabhupada turned to his writing. Although 2 years had passed since he had published a book, a third and final volume of first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, he had daily been working sometimes on his translations and commentary of second canto, but mostly on Bhagavad Gita. In the 1940s, in India, he had written an entire Bhagavad Gita translation and commentary, but his only copy had mysteriously disappeared. Then in 1965, after a few months in America, he had begun again, starting with the introduction, which he had composed in his room on 72nd Street in New York. Now thousands of manuscripts, pages filled his trunk, completing his Bhagavad Gita. If his New York disciples Hygrie, formerly an English professor, could edit it, and if some of the other disciples could get it published, that would be an important achievement. But publishing books in America seemed difficult, more difficult than India. Even though in India he had been alone, he had managed to publish 3 volumes in 3 years. Here in America, he had many followers, but many followers meant increased responsibilities. And none of his followers as yet seemed seriously inclined to take up typing, editing, dealing with American businessmen. And despite the dim prospects for publishing the Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada had begun translating another book, Chaitanya Charitamrita, the principal Vaishnava scripture on life and teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Putting on his reading glasses, Prabhupada opened his books and turned on the dictating machine. He studied the Bengali and Sanskrit text, then picked up the microphone, flicked the switch to record, flashing on a small red light and began speaking. While the Lord was going, chanting and dancing, he spoke. No more than a phrase at a time, flicking the switch, pausing and then dictating again. Thousands of people were following him, and some of them were laughing, some were dancing, and some singing. Some of them were falling on the ground, offering obeisance to the Lord. Speaking and pausing, clicking the switch on and off, he would sit straight, sometimes gently rocking and nodding his head as he urged forward his words. Or he would bend low over his books, carefully studying them through his reading glasses. An hour passed and Prabhupada worked on. The building was dark except for Prabhupada's lamp and quiet except for the sound of his voice and click and hum of the dictating machine. He wore a faded peach turn-neck jersey beneath his grey wool chadar, and since he had just risen from the bed, his saffron dhoti was wrinkled. Without having washed his face or gone to bathroom, he sat, absorbed in his work. At least for these few rare hours, the street and the Radha Krishna temple were quiet. The situation, with the night dark, the surroundings quiet, and him at his transcendental literary work, was not much different from his early morning hours in his room at Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan, India. There, of course, he had no dictating machine, but he had worked during the same hours and from the same text, Chaitanya Charitamrita. Once he had begun a verse-by-verse translation with commentary, and another time he had written essays on the text. Now, having just arrived in his corner of the world, so remote from the scenes of Lord Chaitanya's pastime, he was beginning the first chapter of a new English version of Chaitanya Charitamrita. He called it Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He was following what had become a vital routine in his life, rising early and writing the Parampara message of Krishna consciousness. Putting aside all other considerations, disregarding present circumstances, he would merge into the timeless message of transcendental knowledge. This was his most important service to Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. The thought of producing more books and distributing them widely inspired him to rise every night and translate. Prabhupada worked until dawn. Then he stopped and prepared himself to go down to temple for the morning meeting. Though some of the New York disciples had objected, Srila Prabhupada was still scheduled for the mantra rock dance at Avalon Ballroom. It was not proper, they had said, for the devotees out in San Francisco to ask their spiritual master to go to such a place. It would mean amplified guitars, pounding drums, wild light shows, and hundreds of drugged hippies. How could his pure message be heard in such a place? But in San Francisco, Mukund and others had been working on the mantra rock dance for months. It would draw thousands of young people, and then San Francisco Radha Temple stood to make thousands of dollars. So, although among his New York disciples, Srila Prabhupada had expressed uncertainty, he now said nothing to deter the enthusiasm of his San Francisco followers. Sam Spistra, Mukunda's friend and one of the Mantra Rock organizers, explained the idea to Hagrid, who had just arrived from New York. There is whole new school of San Francisco's music opening up. The Grateful Dead have already cut their first record. Their offer to do this dance is great publicity boost just when we need it. But Swamiji says that even Ravi Shankar is Maya, Hagrid said. Oh, it's been all arranged, Sam assured him. All the bands will be on stage and Allen Ginsberg will introduce Swamiji to San Francisco. Swamiji will talk and then chant Hare Krishna, with bands joining in. Then he leaves. There should be around 4,000 people there. Srila Prabhupada knew that he would not compromise himself. He would go, chant and then leave. The important thing was to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna. If thousands of young people gathering to hear rock music could be engaged in hearing and chanting the names of God, then what was the harm? As a preacher, Prabhupada was prepared to go anywhere to spread Krishna consciousness. Since chanting Hare Krishna was absolute, one who heard or chanted the names of Krishna, anyone, anywhere, in any condition, could be saved from falling to the lower species in the next life. These young hippies wanted something spiritual, but they had no direction. They were confused, accepting hallucinations as spiritual visions. But they were seeking genuine spiritual life, just like many of the young people on the Lower East Side. Prabhupada decided he would go. His disciples wanted him to, and he was their servant, and the servant of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda, Sam, and Harvey Cohen had already met with the rock entrepreneur Chet Helms, who had agreed that they could use his Avalon Ballroom and that if they could get the bands to come, everything above the cost for the groups, the security, and a few other basics would go as profit for San Francisco's Radha Krishna temple. Mukund and Sam had then gone calling on the music groups, most of whom lived in the Bay Area, and one after another, exciting new San Francisco rock bands. The Grateful Dead, Moby Grab, Big Brother, and Holding Company. Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service had agreed to appear with Swami Bhaktivedanta for the minimum wage of $25, $250 per group, and Allen Ginsberg had agreed. The lineup was complete. In San Francisco, every rock concert had an art poster, many of them designed by the psychedelic artist called Mouse. One thing about Mouse poster was that it was difficult to tell where the letters left off and the background began. He used dissonant colors that made the poster seem to flash on and off, borrowing from this tradition. Harvey Cohen has created a unique poster, Krishna Consciousness Comes West, using red and blue concentric circles and a candid photo of Swamiji smiling in Tompkins Square Park. The devotees put the posters up all over the town. Hygriva and Mukunda went to discuss the program for Mantra Rock Dance with Allen Ginsberg. Allen was already known as an advocate of Hare Krishna mantra In fact, acquaintances would often greet him with Hare Krishna. When he walked on the Hate Street, he was known to visit and recommend that others visit Radha Krishna temple. Hagrid, whose full beard and long hairs rivaled Ellen's, was concerned about the melody Ellen would use when he chanted with Swamiji. I think the melody you use, Hagrid said, is too difficult for good chanting. Maybe, Ellen admitted. But that's the melody I first heard in India. A wonderful lady saint was chanting it. I am quite accustomed to it, and it's the only one I can sing convincingly. With only a few days remaining before the mantra rock dance, Ellen came to an early morning kirtan at temple and later joined Srila Prabhupada upstairs in his room. A few devotees were sitting with Prabhupada eating Indian sweets, and when Ellen came to the door, he and Prabhupada smiled and exchanged greetings, and Prabhupada offered him a sweet, remarking that Mr. Ginsburg was up very early. Yes, Ellen replied. The phone hasn't stopped ringing since. Page number. Oh. Page number is minus 30. Yes. I arrived in San Francisco. That is what happens when one becomes famous, said Prabhupada. That was the tragedy of Mahatma Gandhi also. Whenever he went, thousands of people would crowd about him, chanting Mahatma Gandhi ki jai, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. The gentleman could not sleep. Well, at least it got me up for Kirtan this morning, said Ellen. Yes, that's good. The conversation turned to upcoming program at the Avalon Ballroom. Don't you think there is a possibility of chanting a tune that would be more appealing to Western ears? Ellen asked. Any tune will do, Srila Prabhupada said. Melody is not important. What is important is that you will chant Hare Krishna. It can be in tune of your own country, that does not matter. Prabhupada and Ellen also talked about the meaning of the word hippie. And then Ellen mentioned something about taking LSD. Prabhupada replied that LSD created dependence and was not necessary for a person with Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness resolves everything, Prabhupada said. Nothing else is needed. At the Mantra Rock dance, there would be multimedia light show by the biggest names in the art. Ben, Van Meter and Roger Hilliard. Page number 70. 70. I skipped my 4 pages. I was on 13, then now I'm on 17. Yeah. Someone placed a microphone before Srila Prabhupada, and his voice resounded strongly over the powerful sound system. The tempo quickened. Srila Prabhupada was perspiring profusely. Kirtananand insisted that the Kirtan stop. Swamis were too old for this. He said it might be harmful, but the chanting continued, faster and faster, until the words of mantra finally became indistinguishable amidst the amplified music and the chorus of thousands of voices. Then suddenly it ended, and all that could be heard was loud hum of amplifiers and Srila Prabhupada's voice, ringing out, offering obeisance to his spiritual master. Om Vishnupad Paramhans Parivirajak Ashtotter Shat Shri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Maharaj Ki Jai. All glories to assembled devotees. Srila Prabhupada made his way off stage, through the heavy smoke and crowds, and down the front stairs with Kirtanananda and Ranchoda close behind him. Ellen announced the next rock group. As Swamiji left the ballroom and the appreciative crowd behind, he commented, "This is no place for a brahmachari." The next morning, the temple was crowded with young people who had seen Swamiji at the Avalon. Most of them had stayed up all night, Srila Prabhupada having followed his usual morning schedule came down at 7, held Kirtan and delivered the morning lecture. Later that morning, while riding to the beach with Kirtananand and Hagri, Swamiji asked how many people had attended last night's Kirtan. When they told him, he asked how much money they had made, and they said they were not sure, but it was approximately $1,500. Half audibly, he chanted in his back seat of the car, looking out of the window, as quiet and unamusing as a child, with no indication that the night before he had been cheered and applauded by thousands of Hindus, who had stood back and made a grand aisle for him to walk in a triumph across the strobe-lit floor amid the thunder of the electric basses and pounding drums of the Avalon ballroom. For all the fanfare of the night before, he had remained untouched, the same as ever in personal demeanor. He was aloof, innocent, and humble, while at the same time appearing dignified and ancient. As Kirtanand and Hagri were aware, Swamiji was not of this world. They knew that he, unlike them, was always thinking of Krishna. They walked with him along the boardwalk near the ocean with its cool breezes and cresting waves. Kirtanand spread the chadar over Prabhupada's shoulders. In Bengali, there is one nice verse Prabhupada remarked, breaking his silence. I remember, oh, what's that voice across the sea calling, calling? Come here, come here. Speaking little, he walked the boardwalk with his two friends, frequently looking out at the sea and sky. As he walked, he softly sang a mantra that Kirtananda and Hagri had never heard before. Govinda Jai Jai, Gopal Jai Jai, Radha Raman Hari Govinda Jai Jai. He sang slowly, in a deep voice. As they walked along the boardwalk, he looked out at the Pacific Ocean. Because it is great, it is tranquil. The ocean seems to be eternal, Hagri ventured. No, Prabhupada replied, nothing in this material world is eternal. In New York, since there were so few women present at the temple, people had inquired whether it were possible for a woman to join Krishna conscious movement. But in San Francisco, that question never arose. Most of the men who came to learn from Swamiji came with their girlfriends. To Prabhupada, these boys and girls, eager for chanting and hearing about Krishna, were like sparks of faith to be fanned into steady, blazing fires of devotional life. There was no question of asking the newcomers to give up their girlfriends or boyfriends, and yet he uncompromisingly preached no illicit sex. The dilemma, however, seems to have an obvious solution: marry the couples in Krishna consciousness. Because traditionally a sannyasi would never arrange or perform marriages. By Indian standards, sometimes might criticize Prabhupada for allowing any mingling of the sexes. But Prabhupada gave priority to spreading Krishna consciousness. What Indian, however critical, had ever tried to transplant the essence of India's spiritual culture into the Western culture? Prabhupada saw that to change the American social system and completely separate the man from woman would not be possible. But to compromise the standard of no illicit sex was also not possible. Therefore, Krishna conscious married life, the Grasta ashram, would be the best arrangement for many of his new aspiring disciples. In Krishna consciousness, husband and wife would live together and help one another in spiritual progress. It was an authorized arrangement for allowing a man and woman to associate. If as a spiritual master he found it necessary to perform marriages himself, he would do it. But first these young couples would have to become attracted to Krishna consciousness. John Campanella had grown up in wealthy suburb of Portland, Oregon, where her father was a corporate tax attorney. She and her sister had their own sports car and their own boats for sailing on Lake Oswego. Disgusted by the sorority life at the University of Oregon, John had dropped out during her first term and enrolled at Reed College, where she had studied ceramics, weaving, and calligraphy. In 1963, she had moved to San Francisco and become the co-owners of ceramic shops. Although she had then had many friends among fashionable shopkeepers, folk singers, and dancers, she had remained aloof and introspective. It was through her sister Jane that John had first met Srila Prabhupada. Jane had gone with boyfriend Michael Grant to live in New York City, and Michael had worked as a music arranger. In 1965, they had met Swamiji while he was living alone on the Bowery, and they had become his initiated disciples, Mukund and Janaki. Swamiji had asked them to get married, and they had invited John to the wedding. As the wedding guest for one day, John had then briefly entered Swamiji's transcendental world at 26 Second Avenue, as he had kept her busy all day making duff, filling kachoris, pastries for the wedding feast. John had worked in one room and Swamiji had worked in the kitchen. Although he had repeatedly come in and guided her in making kachoris properly, telling her not to touch her clothes or body while cooking, instructing her not to smoke cigarettes because the food was to be offered to Lord Krishna and therefore had to be prepared purely. John had been convinced by this brief association that Swamiji was a great spiritual teacher, but she had returned to San Francisco without pursuing Krishna consciousness further. A few months later, Mukund and Janaki had driven to the west coast with plans of going soon to India, but had changed their plans and Mukund had received a letter from Swamiji asking him to try to start Krishna conscious temple in California. Mukund had talked about Swamiji to John and other friends, and he had found that lot of young people were interested. John had then accompanied Mukunda, Janaki, and a boy named Roger Segal to the mountains in Oregon, where they had visited their mutual friends Sam and Majurai, who had been living in the forest lookout tower. Mukund had explained what he had known of Krishna consciousness, and the six of them had begun chanting Hare Krishna together. They had been especially interested in Swamiji's teachings about elevating consciousness without drugs. Mukund had talked excitedly about Swamiji's having asked him to start temple in California, and soon he and his wife Janaki, Sam and his girlfriend Mary, and Roser and John, now intimate friends, had moved to an apartment in San Francisco to find a storefront and set the stage for the Swamiji. After Swamiji's arrival, John had begun attending the temple pilgrims. She felt drawn to Swamiji and the chanting. She especially liked the informal visiting hours. Swamiji would sit on his rocking chair with his hands in his beadware, chanting the holy names. And John would sit fascinated, watching his fingers moving within his bag. One day during Swamiji's visiting hours, while Swamiji was sitting in his rocking chair and John and others were sitting at his feet, Janaki's cat crept in through the hallway door and began slowly coming down the hallway. Page number 23. Mukund and his wife Janaki, whose apartment was just down the hall from the Srila Prabhupada, were the only couple Srila Prabhupada had already initiated and married. Mukund, who often wore his strand of large red japa beads in two loose loops around his neck, had grown long hair and a short, thick black beard since coming to San Francisco. He had entered the summer of and was acquainted with many of the popular figures. Although occasionally earning money as a musician, he spent most of his time Prabhupada's mission, especially by meeting people to arrange gala programs like that, the one at Avalon. He was a leader in bringing people to assist Prabhupada, yet he had no permanent sense of commitment. He was helping because it was fun. Having little desire to be different from his many of San Francisco friends, he did not strictly follow Srila Prabhupada's principle for regulated spiritual life. In his exchange with Prabhupada, Mukund liked to assume a posture of fraternal camaraderie rather than one of the menial servitude. And Srila Prabhupada reciprocated. Sometimes, however, Prabhupada would assert himself as a teacher. Once, when Prabhupada walked into Mukund's apartment, he noticed a poster on the wall showing a matador with a cap and a sword going after a bull. This is a horrible picture, Srila Prabhupada exclaimed, his face showing displeasure. Mukund looked at the poster, realizing for the first time what it meant. Yes, it is horrible, he said, and tore it off the wall. Srila Prabhupada was eager to have someone play the mridanga properly during the kirtans, and Mukund as a musician was a likely candidate. Mukund. The day the drum came, I asked Swamiji if I could learn, and he said, I asked him when he said, when do you want? Now, I asked. He said, yes. I was a little surprised to get such a quick appointment, but I brought the drum to his room, and he began to show me the basic beat. First, there was Gita-ta, 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 and then one slightly more complicated, Gita-ta, 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 Gita. As I began to play the beat, I kept speeding it up, and he kept telling me to slow down. He spent a lot of time just showing me how to strike the heads of the drum. Then I finally began to get it a little, but he had to keep admonishing me to slow down and pronounce the syllables as I hit the drums, Gita-ta. The syllables, he said, in the drums should come the same. I should make it sound like that and always pronounce them. I was determined and played very slowly for a long time. I was concentrating with great intensity, and suddenly I was aware of Swamiji standing motionless beside me. I didn't know how long he was going to stand there without saying anything, and I became a little uncomfortable. And I got up the courage to look up and see his face. To my surprise, back and forth in an affirming way with his eyes closed. He seemed to be enjoying the lesson. This came to me with surprise. Although I had taken music lessons before and had spent many years taking piano lessons, I can never remember an instance when the teacher seemed to actually enjoy my playing. I felt very wonderful to see that there was a teacher who was perfect, who enjoyed what he was teaching so much. Not because it was personal teaching or personal method, but because he was witnessing Krishna's energy pass through him, a conditioned soul like myself. And he was getting great pleasure out of it. I had a deeper realization that Swamiji was a real teacher, although I had no idea what a spiritual master really was. To Mukund's wife Janaki, Krishna consciousness meant dealing in a personal way with Swamiji. As long as she was around, she was all right. She enjoyed asking him questions, serving him, and learning from him how to cook. She did not care much for studying the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but she quickly developed an intense attraction for him. Janaki. There was a group of us sitting around in Swamiji's apartment, and I asked him if he had been any children. He looked at me as if I had said something strange, and he said, "You are not my children?" I said, "Well, yes," and he said, "Are not all these my children?" And his answer was just so quick that I never doubted that he seriously meant what he said. For several hours each morning, Prabhupada showed Janaki, John and others how to cook. One day in the kitchen, he noticed a kind of berry and he had never tasted. When he asked Janaki what they were, she told him sweet strawberries. He immediately popped one into his mouth, saying, "That's very tasty." And he proceeded to eat another and another, exclaiming, "Very tasty." One time, Janaki was making whipped cream and Prabhupada came into the kitchen and asked, "What's that?" She replied, "It's whipped cream." "What's whipped cream?" he asked. "It's cream," she replied, "but when you beat it, it fluffs up into a more solid form." Although always adamant about kitchen rules, one of the most important being that no one could eat in the kitchen, Srila Prabhupada immediately dipped one finger into the whipped cream and tasted it. "That's yogurt," he said. In a light-hearted, reprimanding way, that was her pleasure, Janaki replied, "No, Swamiji, it's whipped cream." Srila Prabhupada corrected her, "No, it's yogurt." And again, he put his finger into it and tasted it, saying, "It tastes very nice." Swamiji, Janaki accused him, "You are eating in the kitchen." Srila Prabhupada merely smiled and shook his head back and forth, saying, "That's all right." Janaki. One time I told Swamiji I had most exciting dreams. We were all on a planet of our very own, and everybody from Earth had come there. They had all become pure devotees, and they were all chanting. You were sitting on a very special chair, high off the ground, and the whole earth was clapping and chanting Hare Krishna. Swamiji smiled and said, "Oh, that's such a lovely dream." Bonnie MacDonald, age 19, and her boyfriend, Gary McElroy, 20, had both come to San Francisco from Austin, where they had been living together students at the University of Texas. Bonnie was slight, fair blonde, with sweet southern drawl. She was born and raised in southeast Texas in the Baptist family. In high school, she had become agnostic, but later, while traveling in Europe and studying the religious art there, the architecture of great cathedrals, she had concluded that these great artists could not have been completely wrong. Gary, the son of US Air Force officer, had been raised in Germany, Okinawa, and other places around the world before his family had settled in Texas. His dark hair and bushy brows gave him a scowling look, except when he smiled. He was one of the first students of the University of Texas to wear long hair and experiment with psychedelic drugs. While taking LSD together, he and Bonnie had become obsessed with the idea of going on the spiritual search. And without notifying their parents or school, they had driven to West Coast in search of someone who could teach them about spiritual life. They had spent few frustrating months searching through spiritual books, and amongst the spiritual groups in the hit Ashwari, they had become vegetarians. Gary had started teaching himself to play electric guitar, while Bonnie had gone to Golden Gate Park every day to perform a self-styled heart yoga meditation. But gradually they had become disillusioned and had felt themselves become degraded from drugs. When the disciple is ready, the guru will appear, they had read, and they had waited eagerly for the day when their guru would come. Although Bonnie had spent most of her time in the park of San Francisco, one day she had been looking through a table full of magazines in Head shop when she had found a copy of Back to Godhead, the mimeographed journal produced by Srila Prabhupada's disciple in New York. She had been particularly attracted to Haigrip's article about Swamiji. The description of Swamiji's smile, his bright eyes, his pointy-toed shoes, and the things he had said, he had given her a feeling that this might be the guru she had been looking for. And when she had learned that the same Swamiji had opened an ashram in Heteshwari, she came immediately, started searching through the neighborhood until she had found the temple on Frederick Street. Before Bonnie and Gary met Swamiji, they had both been troubled. Gary was in an anxiety about the threat of being drafted into the army, and both of them were disillusioned because they had not found the truth they had come to San Francisco to find. So on meeting Srila Prabhupada in his room, they began to explain their situation. Bonnie, he was sitting in a rocking chair in his little apartment, and he looked at us like we were crazy, because we were, and said, You come to my classes? Simply come to my classes every morning, and everything will be alright." That sounded to us like unbelievable panacea. But because we were so bewildered, we agreed to it. I told him that I had traveled all over Europe, and he said, "Oh, you have traveled so much." And I said to him, "Yes, I have traveled so much. I have done so many things, but none of it ever made me happy." He was pleased with this statement. He said, "Yes, that is a problem." We began going to his morning lectures. For us, it was a long distance to get there at 7 in the morning. But we did it every morning with a conviction to. When we said that former art students at college, he told us to paint pictures. Shortly after that, he asked to be initiated. John and Roger were soon initiated, receiving the names Yamuna and Gurudas. And the very next day, they were married. At their wedding ceremony, Swamiji resided, wearing a bulky garland of leaves and rhododendron flowers. He sat on the cushion on the temple floor, surrounded by his followers and paraphernalia for the sacrificial fire. Before him was a small mound of earth where he would later build the fire. He explained the meaning of Krishna conscious marriage and how a husband and wife should assist one another and serve Krishna, keeping him in the irrepressible hippies were took a seat on the floor, off more by the presence of the Swamiji. Then after the Kirtan Prabhupada lectured, but they found his accent heavy. They wanted to understand. They had an innate feeling that he was saying something valuable. And yet the secret seemed locked behind a thick accent and within a book written in another language. They decided to come back in the morning and try again. At the morning program, they found a smaller group, a dozen devotees with beads or chanting wrapped around their necks, a few street people. The kirtan seemed sweeter and more mellow. Mike and Nancy chanted and danced along with the devotees. Then Prabhupada spoke, and this time they caught a few of his ideas. They stayed for the breakfast and became friends with Nutan Janvi.
आपको
Thank you. With the commentary is later. So you reading now?
भागवतम ये टोल दे
Wellington. Short range, no? Short range. 5 मिनट के बाद गाड़ी उठाने लगे। निम्बल का बुला
Yes.
गाड़ी मोटर
You want to go to what?
गाड़ी मोटर
Gadi?
गाड़ी मोटर
Gadi boat. Yes, Gadi boat.
very cold today or left today?
Normal Maharaj. Like yesterday.
Bringing गाड़ी मोटर
Yes, Maharaj, it is ready. Young. Yes, ma'am.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare हरे कृष्णा। इस्कॉन गाजियाबाद में है गुरु महाराज, इस्कॉन गाजियाबाद। दिखा देते हैं। श्री राधा मदन मोहन की जय, श्री गौर निताय की जय, जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्रा सुदर्शन की जय, श्री कृष्ण बलराम की जय, गिरिराज महाराज की जय, श्री लक्ष्मण नरसिंह देव भगवान की जय, उग्र नरसिंह देव भगवान की जय, प्रहलाद महाराज की जय, जय निताय गुरु हरि प्रेमानंदे, हरि हरि बोल। शारदीय एकादशी महामहोत्सव की जय।